If you've ever tried to make sense of all the denominations out there, chances are you hit a wall. Because you have to make sense of names like Roman Catholic, Baptist, Pentecostal, Reformed, Presbyterian, Methodist, and the list goes on, and your head is probably swimming. Well, I'm hoping this video helps you. Because denominations, they're complicated, they're tangled, but not as complicated and tangled as you might think. I think this video will provide some clarity. I'm Dr. Nathan Hitchcock, formerly a church history professor, studied at the University of Edinburgh in Scotland. I'm now an educational consultant with Seven-Sided Consulting. But I love this stuff, and I would love to help you make some sense of these things. In this fairly short video, we'll go through all this. And just right away, some caveats. I am going to focus on Western denominations mostly, and I am going to focus as we move along on American denominations. But I think whichever nation you hail from, if you're part of the modern world, you should find this helpful. Right away, let's do some myth busting. Just get some myths out of the way, because there's a lot of them out there about denominations. First, denominations are different religions. Not true. By definition, denominations are not different religions. A denomination is a subset of a religion. Denominations are branches of the same tree, you might say. Notice that denomination, that word, has the root nom in it. That means name. Christian denominations are all called by the same name, Christ or Christian. So all denominations are all Christian, just different versions of the name. Now, if you're talking about a different religion truly, like Buddhism or Islam, that's one thing. Or if you're talking about a cult which really has veered away from Christianity entirely, that's different. But a denomination is all part of the same Christian family, shares the same name. How about a second myth? Denominations are simply a product of disunity. I don't know about you, but I love awkward family photos. You find them online. Just ridiculous photos of dysfunctional families, and their dysfunction is caught there in the freeze frame. Beautiful, funny stuff. Well, aren't denominations like that? No, not all of them by any means. Some have been created by disunity. They've been torn apart by schism. Schism is the technical term for split, S-C-H-I-S-M, schism. And some of those splits are over matters of doctrine or worship or personality struggles. But here's the truth. Denominations are actually a creation of church-state separation. Think about it. If you have church-state unity, you really only have one church per country. And therefore, you just have the Christian church in this country or that country, the Ethiopian church or the Danish church or what have you. But if you have genuine freedom of religion, and church-state is not completely bound together, that leaves the possibility of voluntary societies, voluntary association with churches. And that's when you get denominations. Christians bind themselves together voluntarily. So it's better to think of denominations as different families within the larger family. Here's a third myth, a really popular one. It says, there are tens of thousands of denominations, which is usually followed up with, how can I possibly pick one? Or how can they possibly be all right? There are tens of thousands of denominations. Not really. When people count it that way, tens of thousands, they're counting independent churches and multi-site churches, which shouldn't really count as denominations. They're very, very small, or even a denomination of one. Moreover, the vast majority of the tiny denominations are sectarian groups, usually Baptist or Pentecostal, we'll find out. More truthfully, we're looking at hundreds of denominations in America. If you look at the substantial ones, probably in the hundreds. Or if the really truly substantial ones, like kind of the key players, we're talking dozens. So it's not nearly the tens of thousands that people talk about there. It's a smaller number. And maybe at this juncture, you're like, yeah, but there's still dozens of denominations. There's just too many choices. Like, which one should I pick? That's not the purpose of this video. And besides, it's like an ice cream store. Like, yeah, it's a problem, but it's kind of a good problem, right? Okay, let's get to the history. So yes, when Christianity starts, there is one church. Or to put it in the language of the Nicene Creed from the 300s, one holy Catholic and Apostolic Church. Just one church, Jesus, the 12 disciples who become the 12 apostles, and from there Christianity spreads out. This video is not meant to be comprehensive here, but I should tell you that there are epicenters that crop up within early Christianity. You have epicenters in Jerusalem, Antioch, Alexandria down in Egypt, then Rome and Constantinople. And it was simply the church, the one church. It was called the Way at first, but just the church, the Christian church. Even so, one might summarize the first millennium of the Christianity as one family. It was, generally speaking, one holy Catholic and apostolic church. In fact, that word Catholic, don't be freaked out by it if you're not Roman Catholic. Catholic is being unified. That's what it means. According to the whole. Catholic. Unified, even uniform. Well, this unity of the early church was helped in the 300s by Christianity being fully legalized, and then it became a preferred religion of the empire, and then even the official religion of the empire. But there was pulling along the way. Even in these early centuries, that one church has a kind of pulling apart, and it's really along west-east lines. The West, I don't want to go into this too much, but the West was using Latin. It had its base in Rome. And the Western Church was much more hierarchical. So it had bishops and archbishops, and then it had this kind of super bishop, the Bishop of Rome, namely the Pope. Whereas in the East, it's less hierarchical, and it has its center in Constantinople, not in Rome. And it was using Greek. It was just different. The cultures were pulling apart. They had a different approach to worship, a different approach to the use of icons and things like that. But it was still one church until 1054, that is. This takes us to the first creation of denominations, for real. And it's West and East. The Western Church becomes the Catholic Church, and the Eastern Church becomes the Orthodox Church. And it happens because of an awful, messy divorce. The year is 1054, and representatives from the West and the East mutually excommunicate each other. That is, they say the other party is not part of the church. They're cut off. Or they're anathematized. They're even cursed. And those curses, by the way, weren't revoked until 1965. This was a really ugly family breakup. Well, it had been coming for a while, as I've mentioned. The West and the East had been divided over a number of things. There was also a theological battle. The West had inserted one word into the Nicene Creed, the word filioque, meaning and the Son, the Spirit coming from not just the Father, but also the Son. Anyway, big old mess. And in 1054, you have that schism. I would encourage you to read up on the Great Schism. There's a whole lot behind that. That culminates in 1054. Well, the Western Church goes on, centered around the Pope in Rome. The Eastern churches, we don't have time to talk about it here, become increasingly nationalized. So you have the Russian Orthodox Church, the Greek Orthodox Church, so on and so forth. But we're going to focus on the Western side here as it turns into denominations. And when it comes to the West, it's kind of like the making of a beer. It's fermenting. The West was just in ferment, and kind of like a Belgian beer, it can go really well, develop interesting notes, or it can go really, really sideways, which is by and large what happened in the Middle Ages, especially the 1300s going into the 1400s. Lots of chaos in the Western Church, and the reforms that are put forward just don't take. So by the time you hit the 1500s, the church is in desperate need of reform, and that's when you have a guy named Martin Luther come forward. And you may go, oh, Martin Luther, yes, I know that name. He's the one who led the Reformation. And here's where we have to be more nuanced than that. Martin Luther did not lead the Reformation, the Protestant Reformation. He was actually just one leader in the Protestant Reformation, and while everybody was influenced by him, there were many groups that were working at the same time. Specifically, there were 4, and you're going to want to know these 4 when you talk about the Protestant Reformation because it will help you understand denominations from here on out. Really important stuff. Again, there's not one Protestant Reformation, there are 4 of them. And let me take it from the softest Reformation, the most mild Reformation, to the strongest one, that is the most dramatic. So the softest Reformation, a light reform, would be in the Anglican Church. The Anglican Reformation happens in England. It's a reform of the Church of England. And they really want to keep most of the stuff that's there in the Western Church. A lot of Roman Catholic practices, but they are reforming things, and actually there's some division as to how aggressively they should reform. But the Anglican Church, by and large, looks like a high church. That is, it has a more formal liturgy. A lot of its doctrine is much like the older Catholic Church, has some of those old sensibilities. Well, then you have the Lutheran Church, the Lutheran Reformation. And sure enough, this one is named after Martin Luther. But the Lutheran Reformation is just as indebted to a guy named Philip Melanchthon. If you have time, go check him out, Philip Melanchthon. And Lutheranism is created there. In what we know as Germany today, it wasn't Germany back then, it was part of the Holy Roman Empire. But you have different countries around that region who begin to join in, up into Denmark and Scandinavia. And there are various places that begin following the Lutheran Reformation, which also is not a very aggressive Reformation. They're keeping a lot of the old medieval practices and beliefs, but they are hitting really hard justification by faith and some of other Martin Luther's doctrines that he was teaching. Which takes us to the Reformed Reformation. This third Protestant Reformation is happening at the same time, and it's churches that are in Switzerland, and you can see here on the map, places like Scotland, places in France, into Hungary and Poland. And these churches are highly collaborative. They end up in the Netherlands too, the Dutch. They get kind of a slow start, but the second generation, a guy comes along by the name of John Calvin. And John Calvin is very helpful in helping them to organize their theology, organize their church government. He's very much about confessions, that is, declaring one's faith through statements of faith, and very much a friendly guy who was working with lots of different people. He also gets known, rather all the Reformed get known, for a very strong view of salvation, in which God is the one who initiates salvation through and through. About 100 years after the Reformed Reformation starts, there is a kind of a pulling together of this doctrine in the forms of the doctrines of grace, also known as TULIP, also known as 5-point Calvinism. Check it out sometime when you get time. And again, it's a very strong view of God's sovereign grace. God is the one who initiates salvation. But the important thing here is to recognize that the Reformed churches were all over the place. It was an international movement. They were the ones who wanted to bring together the Protestant groups. And because of political reasons, among other reasons, they were able to do so more effectively than the Lutherans or the Anglicans. And certainly better than the fourth group, the radicals. The Radical Reformation was a reformation that was the most aggressive, the most extreme. It said, let's go back to the roots of Christianity. That's what radical means. Let's go back to the roots, the radus of Christianity, namely the New Testament. Let's be the kind of people like Jesus wanted us to be, living like the disciples. And part of that for the radicals meant we are not going to associate with the state. That is, our churches are not going to have any connection to the state whatsoever. And we're also going to cut off that old church tradition of baptizing our children. Rather, you have to be a believer to be baptized. Well, the Radical Reformation was spreading, but they were spreading in a different way. They were very isolated pockets. They didn't cooperate with each other. They were very independent. It's strange that the radicals would be so influential because they're kind of hated in their day. People just don't like them. They're very independent. They threaten the established order. But here's the thing. The radicals are gung-ho for the Bible. Very, very Bible-based. And they are, they're very experiential. They have a deep experiential faith. And this is attractive to other denominations, especially as the other denominations get caught up in a kind of calcified political environment. And so what happens is that you can see this, that the Radical Reformation begins to influence the Reformed and the Lutheran and the Anglican. And if you look at this next slide, notice what happens. You begin to have some hybrids. If you want to understand denominations, where they come from, you have to understand that the Protestant Reformations begin to hybridize. You have this hybridization of radical thought, especially with different groups like the Lutherans first, and then also the Reformed. These were pietist groups. You can hear the word piety in there, the kind of warm experience, the warm worship of God. Pietism, there were certain expressions of Lutheranism and then Reformed life that were pietistic. And you have the same thing happen in the Anglican Church. You have a kind of hybrid between the radicals with the Anglicans, and you end up with Methodists. You may have heard the name John Wesley, who is a major exponent of this pietist movement in Anglicanism, and that comes across as Methodism. Yeah, it's still Anglican. You still have the rites and the rituals and things like that. But you also have this kind of warm interior emphasis of Christianity, along with a very strong emphasis on the Bible. And this becomes an important denomination. Methodism, first in England and what we know as the UK now, and then beyond, all the way over into America. There are pietist groups that spring up elsewhere, even become independent, like the Moravians. But then you have other groups, too, that are even more complicated. For example, the Baptists. The Baptists are a fusion of radical thought with Reformed. They have some Reformed emphasis on order, but they're also very radical. They are free people. They want to be free from the state. And they also want people to be free to choose their own baptism, not to be baptized as infants, hence called Baptist, emphasizing baptism, namely believer's baptism. And that actually has, Baptist life does not do well in the rest of the world, but it does really well on American soil. Can you think why a denomination that really emphasizes freedom would do so well on American soil? Then there's one more hybrid I should mention here. You've probably heard of Puritans. Well, the Puritans were a group in England, England first, and that was the Anglican Church that was being purified by the Reformed Reformation, so hybridization that way. But then notice there's also a dose of radical Reformation in there. And you see this come out when the Puritans start talking about congregational autonomy. Like, your church can't tell my church what to do. It also has a deep interior emphasis in Puritanism. So you even have a kind of radical DNA infusing there. So you can see here in that next phase, you have hybridizations that create the next round of denominations. It's at this point that we move over to the New World. And, I'm talking about America at this point, but it's true in other countries as well. Where you have immigration, you have the transplant of churches, which creates new denominations. These aren't schisms necessarily. It's just transporting a group from one country to another. Here are some examples. There's a Dutch wave in the 1600s. They set up in New York and beyond, and they become the Dutch Church in America, later known as the Reformed Church in America. The Puritans, who were in England, they come across and they set up shop here. They become known as the Congregationalists. And then there are German waves. If you look at the 1830s and 40s, you have Lutherans coming across, and they set up as a very conservative denomination, the Lutheran Church Missouri Synod. Other Germans come across, mid-1800s, they're Baptists, and they set up shop as pietistic Baptists, namely North American Baptists. There's a Swedish Baptist group that comes across, 1870s, even before that, the Baptist General Conference, now known as Converge. And you'll notice that it's not just like you have one wave come across and that's the denomination. You actually have new denominations with each wave. So there's another group of Dutch people who come across, and instead of joining the Reformed Church in America, instead they create their own denomination, which is more culturally like them, the Christian Reformed Church. And so it goes. As immigrant waves come across, they add on to the denominational mix, and you still see these names today. Yet here's the thing. In America, on American soil, a whole lot of new denominations emerged seemingly spontaneously, rather through the work of the Spirit and through the revivals led by various Christians. You may remember the Great Awakening, or the Second Great Awakening from history class. That Great Awakening in the 1700s really revitalized a number of the congregational churches and Presbyterian churches. The Presbyterians, by the way, were the Scottish immigrants. They were the ones who settled there. But it's the Second Great Awakening that's really the big deal. You just see religious life in America explode during this time, and with it, the explosion of all sorts of Methodist churches, Baptist churches, and that's about through 1820, 1830, something like that. And then the revivals keep on rolling in America in the 1800s. You go a little further along, you have guys like Barton Stone and Alexander Campbell. They're the ones who are teaching a radical return to the New Testament. That should sound familiar, the radicals, and really kind of pulling away from the traditions of the church. And all you need is the Bible. Well, they come up with a denomination called Disciples of Christ. It's a common feature of a lot of these new denominations do not want to call themselves denominations. They think of themselves as non-denominational, but they become, in the end, their own denomination. You also have Adventist groups in America. Adventists are those who expected the imminent return of Christ. Christ could return any day. And some of the bolder prophets would actually prophesy the exact day that Jesus was returning. Even though Jesus said he wasn't going to tell us the day, and nobody knew the day, not even him. Nevertheless, some people said Jesus is coming back on this day. Lots of disappointment there. But there were some Adventist groups that survived all of that, survived those disappointments, and some of them reorganized into a very future-oriented, very eschaton-oriented Christianity. One group that has survived and thrived is Seventh-day Adventists. They're unique too in that their reading of the Bible insists on worshiping on Saturday, the old Sabbath, rather than Sunday, the Lord's Day. And then you have really the great revival of the 20th century, Pentecostalism. A whole new denomination, in fact, a bunch of denominations spring out of this movement that starts in, of all places, Los Angeles, California. In 1906, the Azusa Street revivals sees an outpouring of the Holy Spirit. Lots of people, men and women, black and white and other races, are filled with the Holy Spirit. And there's a new Pentecost. So they call themselves the Pentecostals. And Pentecostalism spreads not just through America, but indeed through the world. So earlier I mentioned that some of the denominations that have come about came about through schism. That is, a splitting away, a cutting in half, or a pulling away from a certain body. That is the case along the way. Let me give you some examples. In America, you have the Church of England, the Anglican Church, which during the Revolutionary War, of course, is kind of pulled between these nations. And long story short, the Anglican Church, the Church of England in America, becomes known as the Episcopal Church. The Episcopal Church, Episcopal meaning bishop-led. It also becomes the Methodist Church. The Methodist was a kind of pietistic revolution that was going on in Church of England circles. Well, they just become the Methodist Church in America. But it is suffering fragmentation. One of the reasons why is because a lot of those churches are discriminatory. And so blacks, free blacks in the North, start the African Methodist Episcopal Church. As the Civil War approaches, you have Baptists who begin to divide over cultural issues, especially slavery. You have the Southern Baptist Church, which is pro-slavery, and then the Northern Baptist Church, which is abolitionist. Similar thing when it comes to the Methodist Church. You have the Wesleyans who pull away over the issue of slavery as well as church governance. And then the Church of Christ, Christian. Here's another non-denominational church that comes up during the revivals. I believe they pull out of the Disciples of Christ. They're saying things like, we don't want to use instruments in worship. We don't think that's biblical. Just use God's word. And it turns out that along the way, you have other things. I should read the Presbyterian Church in America. Fast forwarding a bit, you have schisms in the 20th century. This video is really not going to cover liberalism and evangelicalism at all. But there is a response against liberalism, this kind of orientation to the modern world, to modernism. And the Presbyterian Church in America is a conservative response to that and pulls away from what gets known as the Presbyterian Church USA. So Presbyterians begin to fragment. And then even the Dutch Reformed churches have this. The United Reformed Church pulls away from the Christian Reformed Church in 1996. The Alliance of Reformed Churches pulls away from the Reformed Church in America in 2021. Interesting things when it comes to schisms. And they're not all dividing over the same reasons. I hope you see that. Okay, by this time you're seeing the family tree. That big church tree is enormous, lots of branches and branches on branches, and it spreads out quite a bit. Well, the analogy starts to break down a little bit for this last group because there's a number of denominations that come about through mergers. That is, they combine. So it looks like a new denomination, but it's actually the elimination of other denominations. You're actually getting fewer denominations because of these mergers. A number of them happened in the 20th century especially. A few examples here you can see. Evangelical Free Church. That was a combination of Swedish and Norwegian churches. The United Methodist Church consolidated in 1968. I think it had some other consolidations along the way. And that's where you have different Methodist groups that have kind of spread out. Well, they come together. The PCUSA, Presbyterian Church USA, is a conglomerate of other denominations. That is the biggest Presbyterian group. They've combined a number of denominations. ELCA, that is the Evangelical Lutheran Church of America, likewise combined a number of Lutheran denominations. The Mennonites, even the Mennonites, who were very independent and spread out, they came together under a common banner. So you can see here denominations are also created through unity. Okay, so where does this leave us? It leaves us with a really big mess. Yeah, but not as big of a mess as you might have thought. There's dozens of denominations out there. You probably can and should know if you want to be a mature pastor, a mature Christian leader, or if you're doing ecumenical work. At the same time, it's not endless. There is a way of understanding this. We've seen how after the Great Schism, you have the Protestant Reformation, 4 Protestant groups, and then from there you have some hybrids, you have some immigration, you have some revivals, you have some schisms, you have some mergers. But when you look at all of that, it is a finite group. And I would encourage you to do this. Look online, find some charts that make sense of it. Find some charts that make sense to you. Maybe create your own. I think that'll help you consolidate this information. It'll help you to understand the larger body of Christ. And of course, in the end, I hope you look at this not so much as a glorious mess, so much as a family tree. Yes, it's big. Yes, it's sprawling, but it's all called according to the name of Christ.